My name is Madeline Kane. I am 30 years old. 3 years ago, my father stood up at my wedding reception holding a glass of expensive champagne and announced to 50 guests that my new husband was a charity case. He looked Julian right in the eye, lowered his glass, and deliberately walked past him, refusing to shake his hand. My mother hid her laughter behind a linen napkin. My sister smirked. They told everyone I was ruining my future by marrying a broke dreamer who spent 18 hours a day typing code in a freezing apartment. They treated him like dirt on their shoes. But last month, at the Global Tech and Finance Awards in Manhattan, my father dropped his fork and my sister actually gasped for air. Because the elusive billionaire CEO they had all been desperately trying to court just walked onto the main stage. And it was the exact same man they had publicly humiliated at my wedding. Before I tell you how Julian forced my family to swallow every single insult, please take a second to subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. If you have ever been the disappointment of your family just for following your heart, hit the like button and drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. I love seeing who is listening. Now let me take you back to the beginning of the nightmare, to that backyard wedding 3 years ago, and the moment my family drew a line in the sand. Growing up in the Kane household meant learning that love came with a price tag. My father, Richard, was a senior partner at a ruthless corporate law firm. My mother, Patricia, spent her days securing her status at the local country club. To them, human worth was measured strictly by zip codes and investment portfolios. My older sister, Victoria, understood the assignment early. She married Blake, a loud, arrogant hedge fund manager who wore tailored suits and drove European sports cars. They were the golden couple. Then there was me. I chose to be a public school speech pathologist. I loved my job helping children find their voices, but my salary barely covered rent. When I met Julian, my family wrote him off within 5 minutes. Julian was brilliant and kind, but he had zero capital. He was building a green energy data platform from scratch. Our dining table was covered in server parts and legal pads. He survived on cheap coffee and raw determination. My parents refused to pay for our wedding. They claimed they would not fund a mistake. We scraped together enough money for a modest backyard ceremony. I wore a simple dress. Julian wore a rented suit that did not fit quite right. Victoria and Blake arrived late, wearing designer outfits that cost more than our entire catering budget. They spent the cocktail hour complaining about the cheap wine and the humidity. The real damage happened during the speeches. My father tapped his glass. The yard grew quiet. Instead of welcoming Julianne to the family, my father spent the first 3 minutes of his toast praising Victoria and Blake. He talked about Blake closing a recent real estate deal and Victoria upgrading their summer home. Then his eyes drifted toward our sweetheart table. His smile vanished. He cleared his throat and said he hoped my passion for public service would translate well into my marriage because I had just adopted the ultimate charity case. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the yard. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. Julianne sat frozen next to me. My father stepped away from the microphone. Julianne stood up, holding his hand out in a gesture of peace and respect. My father looked at Julianne's extended hand, let out a short, bitter laugh, and turned his back. I spent my wedding night crying on the edge of our second-hand mattress. Julian did not yell. He did not punch a wall. He just sat beside me and pulled me into his chest. His jaw was tight and his eyes held a cold, sharp focus I had never seen before. He kissed the top of my head and whispered that I needed to give him a little time. He promised me that the people who laughed at us today would eventually beg for our attention. I believed him, but I had no idea just how far my family would go to break us before that day arrived. A year into our marriage, the financial strain became a physical presence in our home. It sat on our shoulders like a lead weight. Julian's green energy startup was entirely pre-revenue. He was building an algorithmic platform designed to optimize regional power grids, but infrastructure tech requires endless development before it yields a single dime. Our living space was a cramped, unventilated one-bedroom walk-up in Queens. The dining area was overtaken by rigged server towers that hummed day and night. The heat generated by the processors forced us to keep the windows open even in the dead of winter. I carried the financial burden alone. I worked double shifts at the pediatric speech clinic. My days were spent on primary colored carpets holding flashcards for toddlers with developmental delays. By the time I took the subway home, my throat burned from exaggerating syllables for 8 straight hours. I took on every extra private client I could find, traveling to their homes on weekends. I hoarded coupons. I bought bulk rice and discounted beans. Julian coded until his eyes went bloodshot, skipping meals because he was locked in a state of deep concentration. We were surviving, but the ice beneath our feet was cracking. The fracture happened on a Tuesday in late November. The sky was the color of bruised iron, pouring freezing rain across the city. I was navigating the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in my 10-year-old sedan. The vehicle had been making a rattling noise for weeks, but we ignored it out of necessity. Halfway over the Kosciuszko Bridge, the steering wheel locked. The dashboard lit up with red warning symbols. Smoke billowed from the edges of the hood, obscuring my windshield. I managed to muscle the dead weight of the car onto the narrow shoulder, while heavy freight trucks blasted past me, rattling my teeth with their wake. The tow truck operator demanded $75 in cash just to attach the winch. I sat in the cab of his rig, shivering in my damp wool coat, watching my only mode of transportation get dragged to a dingy repair shop in an industrial park. The mechanic was a grim man who wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag before delivering the verdict. The alternator was dead. The serpentine belt had snapped. The repair required parts and labor. The total cost was $500. For some segments of society, $500 is a casual Tuesday dinner tab. For us, it was a death sentence. Our joint checking account held exactly $42. Our savings had been entirely depleted the previous month to purchase a specialized graphics processing unit Julian needed to train his data models. I sat on a cracked plastic chair in the waiting area, listening to the screech of pneumatic drills. I had 0 options. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother. Patricia Kane answered on the 4th ring. The background noise coming through the speaker was unmistakable. Ethereal flute music played softly beneath the gentle trickling of an indoor water feature. She was at the Mandarin Oriental Spa in Manhattan, enjoying her bi-weekly wellness retreat. I swallowed my pride. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. I explained the dead alternator, the freezing rain, and the tow truck. I asked for a temporary loan. I promised to pay back the $500 directly from my next clinic paycheck. My mother sighed. It was not a sound of maternal concern. It was the sharp, inconvenienced exhale of a woman interrupted during a hot stone massage. She informed me in a cold, measured tone that she was not a charity bank. She reminded me that she had predicted this exact scenario. Then she delivered the insult that would burn in my memory for years. She suggested that if my husband put down his little computer games and secured a job flipping burgers at a fast food drive-thru, I would not be forced to beg my family for scraps. She told me to figure it out like an adult and hung up the phone. The line went dead. I stared at the blank screen. I opened my mobile browser right there in the smelling waiting room and applied for a high-interest emergency credit card. The annual percentage rate was 24%. The approval was instant. A digital card number flashed onto my screen. I paid the mechanic, knowing I had just changed Julian and myself to a heavy boulder of debt. The psychological toll of that day manifested 4 days later. Sunday dinner attendance at my parents' Connecticut estate was a mandatory requirement. Skipping a family meal was treated as an act of treason. Julian stayed behind in Queens to run a complex diagnostic test on his software. I made the drive alone. The dining room was a theater of wealth. Sterling silver cutlery rested beside crystal goblets. The scent of roasted tenderloin and rosemary filled the air. I sat quietly at the edge of the mahogany table, pushing roasted asparagus around my porcelain plate. The front door swung open. Victoria and Blake made their entrance. Victoria strode into the dining room carrying a brand new quilted lambskin Chanel flap bag. The gold interlocking hardware gleamed beneath the antique crystal chandelier. She did not set it on a chair. She placed it directly in the center of the dining table, ensuring it commanded the room's attention. My mother gasped in sheer delight, reaching across the table to trace the pristine leather. Blake loosened his silk tie, poured himself a generous pour of Bordeaux, and grinned. He announced it was a Tuesday surprise, $8,000 spent simply because his wife looked exceptionally pretty that morning. I sat frozen in my chair, calculating the brutal math. That single handbag could buy 16 alternators. It could fix my broken car 16 times over. I was drowning under a predatory 24% interest rate for a basic life necessity, while my sister paraded $8,000 of casual luxury across the gravy boats. My father raised his glass toward Blake, praising his capability as a provider. Then his eyes locked onto me. He asked where the phantom husband was hiding. I kept my voice perfectly level. I stated that Julian was working. Victoria let out a sharp, practiced laugh. She sipped her wine and asked if typing in a dark room for zero profit still qualified as employment in the real world. I gripped my silver fork until the metal bit into my skin. A fiery heat rose in my chest. I wanted to stand up and flip the porcelain plates onto the Persian rug. But I needed to survive the dessert course. I forced a tight smile and swallowed the humiliation whole. I drove back to Queens in silence. Our apartment was pitch black, except for the blue glow radiating from Julian's dual monitors. He was hunched over his mechanical keyboard. The sandwich I had left for him in the refrigerator remained untouched. I walked up behind his chair and rested my chin on his shoulder. The screen displayed endless, cascading lines of code, a foreign language I could not read. I told him about the credit card. I explained the interest rate, the mechanic, and the fresh debt we had just acquired. I braced myself. I waited for the financial terror to break him. I expected him to throw his hands up, to shout in frustration, or to apologize for failing to protect me. Julian stopped typing. He turned his chair around. The monitor light cast long shadows across his exhausted face. He reached out and took my hands. His palms were warm and calloused. He did not look defeated. He looked terrifyingly calm. His eyes held an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He told me the optimization sequence was finally holding steady. He pulled me down into a tight embrace. His voice was a low, steady rumble against my collarbone. He asked me to grant him 12 more months, just 365 days. He swore to me that if I could hold the line for one more year, we would never look at a price tag again. I nodded into his shoulder. I trusted him implicitly. But 12 months is a dangerous amount of time to survive on sheer willpower, especially when the Kane family was merely warming up. The true depths of their financial cruelty were still waiting for us, perfectly disguised as an upcoming invitation to my father's birthday dinner. 2 weeks after the car breakdown was my father's 60th birthday. The venue was an exclusive French restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, boasting 3 Michelin stars and a months-long waiting list. The dress code was strict. The atmosphere was intimidating. I begged Julian to stay home. I stood in our tiny bedroom holding a thrifted silk dress, watching him knot his only tie. I told him he did not have to subject himself to the firing squad. I offered to go alone, to make an excuse about a coding deadline, to shield him from the inevitable venom. Julian shook his head. He adjusted his collar and met my gaze in the cracked mirror. He told me that I was his wife and he would never send me into a room full of wolves by myself. His loyalty was an anchor, but I knew the Kane family was sharpening their teeth. We drove into Manhattan in my repaired, rattling sedan. Pulling up to the valet stand felt like a cruel joke. Our faded paint job stood in stark contrast to the gleaming, imported luxury vehicles lining the curb. The valet attendant barely masked his disdain as he handed Julian a claim ticket. We walked through the heavy brass doors into a dining room that smelled of roasted truffles and old money. My family was already seated at a prominent circular table. Richard and Patricia anchored the group, radiating wealthy satisfaction. Victoria sat next to Blake, who was already holding a glass of scotch and lecturing a waiter about the proper temperature of a vintage Bordeaux. Blake managed a mid-tier hedge fund, but he carried himself like he personally dictated the global economy. He thrived on dominance. We took our seats. The greetings were glacial. My mother offered a tight, closed-mouth smile while evaluating my dress. She noted aloud that she remembered when I bought it 5 years ago. Victoria chimed in, adding that vintage was very trendy for people on a fixed budget. Julian placed his hand over mine under the tablecloth, his thumb tracing slow, calming circles against my knuckles. The dinner was a grueling endurance test. Course after course of delicate, intricate food arrived. I could barely swallow. Blake ordered 3 separate bottles of wine, each costing more than my monthly rent. He and my father drank heavily, toasting their own brilliant investments and mocking the working class. Julian drank tap water. I nursed a single glass of house wine, trying to remain invisible. By the time the espresso arrived, Blake turned his sights directly onto Julian. He leaned across the white linen tablecloth, his face flushed from the alcohol. He asked how the little computer hobby was progressing. He wanted to know if Julian had managed to find a single gullible person willing to pay real money for imaginary electricity. The table fell silent. My father watched with undisguised amusement. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. I opened my mouth to defend my husband, but Julian gently squeezed my hand to stop me. Julian answered in a polite, even tone. He explained that predictive algorithmic modeling for regional power grids was a complex infrastructure play. He mentioned that optimizing energy flow could reduce municipal waste by 30%, creating a highly lucrative secondary market for carbon credits. He did not brag. He simply stated facts. Blake blinked. The technical precision of Julian's answer flew right over his head. Blake understood aggressive trading and hostile takeovers, but he possessed zero actual capacity for technological innovation. Realizing he was intellectually outmatched, Blake resorted to financial bullying. He scoffed and declared that if it did not yield a quarterly dividend, it was just a fairy tale for broke millennials. Then the waiter approached, carrying a thick black leather folder. The check. My father made a lazy gesture toward Blake, granting him the honor of reviewing the damage. Blake opened the folder. His eyes scanned the final number, and a dark, venomous smile spread across his face. The total was $2,800. Blake tossed the leather folder into the center of the table. He announced that since we were all modern, successful adults, we should embrace an egalitarian approach. He suggested an even 3-way split among the couples, $933 each. The air vanished from my lungs. A cold, paralyzing sweat broke out across my spine. We had not consumed a drop of the vintage wine. We had shared a single appetizer. But pointing that out would be social suicide in this environment. It would confirm our poverty. Victoria tilted her head, letting her diamond earrings catch the light. She asked if there was a problem, staring directly at me with predatory anticipation. My father crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. He watched his youngest daughter drown. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to ask for his help so he could humiliate Julian for failing to provide. I refused to give them the satisfaction. My hands trembled as I reached into my purse. I pulled out the new emergency credit card, the one with the 24% interest rate. I placed it onto the silver tray. The plastic made a sharp clicking sound against the metal. The waiter swept it away. I sat there calculating the devastating reality. That meal just added another $1,000 to our debt. It would take months to pay off the interest alone. I was trading my future financial security just to survive a birthday dinner. Julian watched the transaction in silence. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked rapidly near his temple. The walk back to the valet stand was a silent, agonizing procession. The freezing rain had turned into a steady sleet, coating the Manhattan sidewalks in a layer of treacherous ice. We stood under the restaurant awning, shivering. Blake and Victoria's pristine luxury SUV pulled up first. The valet held the door open for my sister. Before getting into the driver's seat, Blake paused. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored overcoat and pulled out a silver money clip. He slid out a single crumpled $5 bill. He looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Blake flicked his wrist. The $5 bill fluttered through the freezing air and landed in a dirty puddle on the concrete right at Julian's worn leather shoes. Blake told Julian to buy himself a clue. He said maybe he could afford a decent haircut before the next family gathering. He got into his vehicle and sped off, splashing icy water onto the hem of my coat. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears. I was ready to scream at the taillights. But Julian did not react with rage. He bent down slowly. He picked up the soaking wet $5 bill. He smoothed out the creases with deliberate, meticulous movements and folded it into his trouser pocket. His expression was a mask of terrifying calm. Our rattling sedan was brought around. We climbed into the freezing interior. I rested my forehead against the dashboard, letting the tears finally spill over. I whispered an apology to him. I was so deeply sorry for what my family was putting him through. Julian did not answer right away. He started the engine. The heater sputtered, blowing cold air into the cabin. He reached into his coat and pulled out his cell phone. He did not look at me. He looked straight through the windshield into the sleet. He dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. A voice answered on the other end. Julian spoke in a low, authoritative tone I had never heard him use before. It was not the voice of a struggling coder. It was the voice of a commander. He told the person on the line to execute the shadow protocol immediately. He ordered them to move up the timeline and lock out the secondary investors. He stated that he wanted the acquisition finalized and the capital released by Friday morning. He hung up the phone and shifted the car into drive. The freezing rain battered the windshield, but the atmosphere inside the vehicle had permanently shifted. The quiet, patient man I married was gone. The predator had just woken up. The morning after my father's birthday dinner, the atmosphere inside our Queens apartment underwent a seismic shift. The frantic, desperate energy that had defined our lives for 3 years simply vanished. Julian stopped spending 18 hours a day hunched over his dual monitors wearing faded t-shirts. Instead, he began waking up before dawn, showering in the freezing water of our unreliable plumbing, and putting on his only tailored suit. He would leave the apartment before the sun rose and return long past midnight. His face carried the hollowed, sunken appearance of extreme sleep deprivation, but his eyes were bright, focused, and humming with a terrifying electric current. When I asked him what was happening, he pulled me onto our worn sofa. He spoke in low, careful tones, checking the thin walls of our apartment out of habit. He explained that ether dynamics was no longer a theoretical software project. His predictive algorithms had successfully balanced the power load for a mid-sized municipal grid during a severe winter storm, preventing a catastrophic regional blackout. The data was undeniable and the results were flawless. Private equity firms were suddenly circling his company like sharks sensing blood in the water. He told me he was locked under strict non-disclosure agreements during the initial acquisition phase. He could not show me the preliminary term sheets or the projected corporate valuations. He could not even tell me the names of the banking executives he was meeting with. But he held my face in his calloused hands and swore the days of checking our checking account balance before buying generic groceries were over. He asked for my patience for just a few more weeks while the lawyers finalized the structure. Ignorant to the shifting tectonic plates of our financial reality, my sister Victoria decided it was the perfect moment to intervene. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text message inviting me to a late lunch. The venue she selected was an exclusive organic bistro on the Upper East Side, a place where wealthy women picked at overpriced kale salads and discussed their interior designers. I knew stepping into her territory was a calculated risk. Victoria never did anything out of simple sisterly affection. Every interaction she initiated was a social transaction designed to elevate her own status while deliberately diminishing mine. I arrived in my practical clinic clothes, my sensible shoes clicking against the imported tile floor. Victoria was already seated at a prime corner booth, wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and tapping her manicured fingernails against a sparkling water glass. She did not stand to greet me. She simply offered a pitying, condescending smile and signaled the waiter to bring me a menu, pointing out the cheaper appetizers on the list. I ordered black coffee. For the first 20 minutes, she performed her usual routine. She complained about the sheer difficulty of securing a premium slip for Blake's new boat. She sighed heavily over the exhausting, grueling process of interviewing private chefs for their summer home. I let her talk, nodding politely while sipping the bitter coffee. I knew the preamble was just a theatrical setup for the main event. Eventually, she set down her silver fork and leaned across the polished mahogany table. Her expression morphed into a mask of fake, tragic concern. She lowered her voice, leaning in close so the neighboring tables could not hear our conversation. She said she and Blake had been discussing my disastrous financial situation. She stated that Blake felt a deep moral obligation to step in before Julian dragged me down into a homeless shelter. Then she delivered the pitch. Blake was willing to create a position for Julian at his hedge fund. My pulse quickened for a fraction of a second, wondering if Blake had actually recognized Julian's brilliance behind the software code. That brief illusion died instantly. Victoria explained the role was a personal assistant position. Julian would be responsible for fetching Blake's customized morning coffee orders, picking up his dry cleaning, scheduling his afternoon golf outings, and washing his European sports car. The salary was $35,000 a year. 0 benefits, 0 stock options, 0 dignity. Victoria reached across the table and patted my hand with false sympathy. She told me it was an act of pure benevolence. She said Blake pitied Julian and wanted to give him a chance to learn what real hard work looked like by observing a true winner in the corporate arena. She added that $35,000 was incredibly generous for a grown man who had spent the last 3 years playing make-believe on a laptop while his wife paid the rent. A year ago, that offer would have crushed my spirit. I would have felt the burning sting of shame and internalized her cruelty. I would have excused myself to cry in the restaurant bathroom. But sitting across from her now, the dynamic felt entirely different. I remembered the cold, commanding tone Julian used on the phone outside the French restaurant. I remembered the electric focus in his eyes and his promise that the starvation phase was reaching its end. I looked at my sister's smug, self-satisfied face and felt nothing but a quiet, profound pity for her arrogance. I gently pulled my hand away from hers. I kept my voice steady and low. I thanked her for the thought, but informed her that Julian was currently unavailable for administrative duties. I told her we would pass on Blake's generous charity. Victoria's fake smile evaporated into thin air. Her eyes narrowed into harsh, glittering slits. She was deeply offended that the designated peasant of the family had refused her breadcrumbs. She picked up her designer sunglasses and slid out of the leather booth. She tossed a crisp $50 bill onto the table to cover her salad, ensuring I saw the high denomination. She looked down at me and delivered her final warning. She told me that when the eviction notices finally arrived and we were living out of my broken-down sedan, we were strictly forbidden from parking on her driveway. She turned on her heel and marched out of the bistro, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. I took the subway back to Queens. The train car was crowded and noisy, but my mind was perfectly clear. The Kane family had fired their final warning shot. They had drawn their permanent lines and locked their doors against us. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment building and unlocked the deadbolt. The usual chaotic humming noise of the server towers was entirely absent. The apartment was eerily quiet. Julian was sitting at our cramped dining table. The computer monitors were pushed to the side. In their place sat a towering stack of thick legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked bond paper. A sleek, black fountain pen rested in his hand. He was turning pages and signing his name with sharp, precise strokes. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. Julian looked up. His suit jacket was draped over the back of the wooden chair. He did not look exhausted anymore. He looked like a man who had just conquered a hostile continent. He pointed to the thickest stack of papers on the table. The cover page bore the embossed seal of a major global investment bank. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was inked, notarized, and legally binding. My family was eagerly digging their own grave, and Julian had just handed them the golden shovel. But before the trap could snap shut, the universe decided to test the limits of my family's cruelty one final time, forcing a medical crisis that would sever my remaining ties to them forever. The final phase of Julian securing his company required a mandatory trip to the West Coast. The investment bankers driving the acquisition operated out of a high-rise in Seattle. They demanded an in-person meeting to execute the primary transfer of assets. It was a Thursday morning when Julian packed a single worn duffel bag. He stood by the door of our Queens apartment holding his coat. He looked hesitant, reluctant to leave me alone, even for 48 hours. I tied his scarf around his neck and pushed him toward the hallway. I reminded him that we had survived 3 years of poverty, and I could handle 2 days by myself. I told him to go secure our future. He kissed my forehead, promised to call the moment he landed, and walked down the stairwell. Friday arrived with a bitter, creeping chill. I spent the day at the public school clinic conducting speech evaluations for a steady stream of restless kindergartners. By 3 in the afternoon, a dull, throbbing ache began to pool in my lower right side. I ignored it. I assumed it was simple fatigue or muscle strain from carrying heavy boxes of sensory toys up the clinic stairs. I took the crowded subway home, leaning against the plastic partition, trying to breathe through the mounting discomfort. By 7 that evening, the dull ache transformed into a sharp, blinding agony. I was standing in our narrow kitchen, pouring a glass of tap water, when the pain spiked with the intensity of a rusted blade. The glass slipped from my fingers, shattering across the linoleum. I collapsed onto the floor, gripping my stomach. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The room spun. The physical reality of an infected, rupturing appendix is not a slow decline. It is a sudden, violent revolt of the human body. I dragged my upper body across the floor tiles toward the living room, where my cell phone rested on the coffee table. Every inch forward sent shockwaves of nausea up my throat. I managed to pull the phone down. My vision blurred with tears. I dialed Julian first. The call went straight to voicemail. He was somewhere over the Midwest, flying commercial, without reliable internet access. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial pad. In the United States, an ambulance ride can easily generate a bill of $2,000 or $3,000 before a patient even sees a doctor. We were already drowning in high-interest credit card debt. The thought of adding another crippling financial burden paralyzed me. I needed a ride. I needed family. I dialed my parents' home number. It rolled to voicemail. I dialed my mother's cell phone. No answer. Trembling and sweating, I called my father. The phone rang 5 times. Just as the automated recording prepared to take over, the line connected. A wave of ambient noise poured through the speaker. I heard the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the low hum of wealthy conversations, and the smooth rhythm of a live jazz quartet. My parents were attending the annual winter gala at their exclusive Connecticut country club. My father answered with a sharp, impatient tone. He demanded to know why I was interrupting his evening. I curled into a tight ball on the rug, pressing the phone to my ear. I told him I was in terrible pain. My voice shook, breaking over the syllables. I explained that Julian was on a flight and I could not stand up. I begged him to send someone or to come get me and take me to the emergency room. The jazz music played softly in the background. My father did not ask about my symptoms. He did not ask if I was bleeding or losing consciousness. I heard him sigh heavily, cupping his hand over the receiver to muffle his voice as he spoke to someone nearby. He returned to the call. He informed me that he and my mother were currently seated at a private table with the mayor and 2 real estate developers. He stated that leaving a high-level networking event early was out of the question. He told me to stop acting hysterical and to order a standard cab. I pleaded with him. I said I was terrified to go alone. I told him I thought something was bursting inside my stomach. His tone turned to pure ice. He delivered a response devoid of any paternal instinct. He said that if my husband was a real man with a real career, he would be home taking care of his wife instead of flying to the West Coast to play pretend with a fake software company. He told me that my choices had consequences and I needed to handle them like an adult. He hung up. The line beeped 3 times and went silent. I lay on the faded rug for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The betrayal was a different kind of pain, colder and deeper than the ruptured organ festering inside me. My father had weighed my physical safety against a conversation with a local politician and decided I was not worth the inconvenience. Survival instinct overrode the heartbreak. I opened a rideshare application and requested a car. I pulled on a heavy winter coat over my sweat-soaked clothes. It took me 15 agonizing minutes to crawl down 3 flights of stairs. I collapsed onto the icy sidewalk just as a silver sedan pulled to the curb. The driver took one look at my pale face and my trembling hands and rushed to open the back door. He drove me to the nearest city hospital, breaking the speed limit down Queens Boulevard. The triage nurse recognized the severity of my condition the moment I stumbled through the sliding glass doors. The protocol moved fast. Fluorescent lights flashed overhead as they wheeled me down a sterile corridor on a gurney. A surgeon explained the risks of emergency appendectomies. I signed the consent forms with a shaking hand. Before the anesthesia pulled me under, I gave the attending nurse Julian's flight details and asked her to leave him a message. The world faded into dark, quiet oblivion. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh hospital lights were dimmed. A steady rhythmic beeping echoed in the small recovery room. I felt heavy, groggy, and stitched together, but the blinding abdominal pain was gone. I turned my head toward the plastic chair in the corner. Julian was sitting there. He wore the same suit from Thursday morning, but his tie was gone and the top buttons of his shirt were torn open. He looked wrecked. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching my chest rise and fall. When he saw my eyes open, he stood up and rushed to the edge of the bed. He took my hand, pressing it against his forehead. His skin was warm. He whispered my name over and over, apologizing for not being there. My throat felt like sandpaper. I asked him how he got back to New York so fast. Commercial flights from Seattle took hours to board and schedule. Julian kept his eyes fixed on mine. He explained that his plane landed on the West Coast just before midnight. He turned his phone on while taxiing to the gate and received the voicemail from the surgical nurse. He never stepped foot in the Seattle terminal. He arranged for the investment bankers to meet him on the tarmac. He signed the final transfer documents on the hood of a luggage cart. Then he used his newly accessible corporate leverage to charter a private jet back to the East Coast. He had been sitting by my hospital bed since 4 a.m. I squeezed his fingers. The painkillers made my thoughts drift, but a sharp memory pierced through the haze. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes and told him about the phone call. I recounted dragging myself to the door. I told him about the jazz band playing in the background. I repeated my father's exact words about Julian playing pretend on the West Coast and abandoning his wife. Julian stopped stroking my hand. The deep relief that had softened his face just moments ago evaporated. His posture straightened, his jaw locked. The dark, hollow look of the exhausted startup founder vanished entirely. The man staring back at me possessed a terrifying, quiet authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse my father. He gently tucked the hospital blanket around my shoulders and kissed the back of my hand. He looked toward the sterile hospital window, watching the morning sun break over the city skyline. He told me the era of absorbing their insults was over. He said the Kane family had proven exactly who they were when they believed we were starving and desperate. He promised me that their punishment would not be a simple argument. Their punishment would be a devastating revelation of the truth. We were going to show them a reality so brilliant and untouchable, it would burn their eyes to look at it. The game had fundamentally changed. My family thought they had discarded a broken daughter and her failure of a husband. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who now owned the board. I was discharged 48 hours after the emergency appendectomy. The morning air was biting typical for late November in New York, but I barely felt the cold. Julian had arranged a private town car to take us back to Queens. I noticed the plush leather seats and the tinted windows, a stark contrast to my rattling sedan, but my mind was too clouded by residual pain medication to question the expense. Julian rode in silence, his hand resting securely over mine. The tension that had defined his posture for 3 years was entirely gone. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, the kind of quiet confidence possessed only by men who hold all the cards. We walked up the 3 flights of stairs slowly. When he unlocked the deadbolt, our cramped walk-up felt different. The relentless humming of the rigged server towers had ceased. The dual monitors were dark. The apartment was just a quiet, empty room. I eased myself onto the worn fabric of our second-hand sofa, bracing my stitched abdomen. I expected Julian to fetch me a glass of water or help me arrange the pillows. Instead, he walked over to the battered dining table, flipped open his primary laptop, and carried it over to the coffee table. He sat down next to me. The screen cast a cool blue glow across his face. He told me that while I was unconscious in the recovery ward, the legal teams in Seattle had finalized the asset transfers and executed the structural reorganization of Ether Dynamics. He explained that infrastructure tech moves at a glacial pace right up until the exact moment it proves viable, and then it moves with the speed of a shockwave. His predictive algorithmic models were no longer theoretical. They were the new operational standard for a consortium of West Coast energy providers. Julian did not hand me a printed contract or a dense legal dossier. He simply accessed a secure banking portal, entered a sequence of authentication codes, and turned the laptop screen toward me. He stated that he had established a new primary joint account. The dashboard loaded. The stark white background displayed our names in bold black text. Beneath our names sat the available balance. I stared at the screen. My brain, conditioned by years of financial terror, automatically tried to place a decimal point where it belonged. I expected to see a few $1,000s, perhaps enough to cover the hospital deductible and the credit card debt from the French restaurant. But the digits stretched across the screen in a long, unbroken sequence. 8, 2, 5, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. $82,500,000. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The numbers blurred. I reached out and touched the glass of the monitor, convinced it was a digital rendering error or a testing environment. Julian rested his palm against my cheek. His voice was steady, grounding me in the impossible reality. He explained the mechanics of the deal. Ether Dynamics had closed a historic Series B funding round. A syndicate of top-tier venture capital firms had engaged in a fierce bidding war, ultimately valuing his green energy platform at just under $1 billion. As the sole founder and chief executive officer, retaining majority equity, the capital injection triggered an unprecedented secondary buyout of his initial shares. The money sitting in the checking account was merely the liquid fraction of our new net worth. I began to weep. It was not a delicate, quiet cry. It was the ugly, visceral sobbing of a woman who had spent 3 years calculating the cost of generic rice and rationing heating oil. The crushing, suffocating boulder of poverty simply evaporated. The predatory 24% interest rate on the emergency credit card was wiped out of existence. The constant, low-grade panic of losing our apartment, of choosing between groceries and electricity, of being mocked by Blake over a restaurant bill, it was all dead. Julian pulled me against his chest, careful to avoid my incisions, and let me cry until my throat felt raw. When the tears finally subsided, a new, volatile emotion took their place. Rage. Hot, blinding, righteous fury. I pulled away from Julian and reached for my cell phone resting on the edge of the cushion. The desire for immediate vindication burned through my veins like acid. I wanted to dial my father's number. I wanted to interrupt his Sunday golf game and force him to listen to the exact dollar amount sitting in the account of the man he called a charity case. I wanted to text Victoria a screenshot of the balance and watch her choke on her pathetic $35,000 job offer. I wanted to hire a driver to park a fleet of European sports cars right across her pristine suburban driveway. My thumb hovered over the contact list. Before I could press dial, Julian gently placed his hand over my phone. He did not snatch it away. He simply applied enough downward pressure to lower the device back to the table. His eyes met mine. They were calm, calculating, and devoid of the chaotic anger I was feeling. He told me that calling them now would be a tactical error. He explained the psychology of people like Richard and Patricia Kane. If we announced our wealth today, they would instantly rewrite history. They would claim they always believed in his potential. My father would spin his cruel wedding speech as tough love designed to motivate us. Victoria would pretend her degrading job offer was just a quirky sisterly joke. They would smile, raise their glasses, and seamlessly integrate themselves into our new empire without ever facing the consequences of their cruelty. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms. He proposed a different approach. The holiday season was rapidly approaching, starting with the traditional Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' Connecticut estate. He suggested we attend the gathering exactly as we always had. We would arrive in the rattling sedan. We would wear our faded, practical clothes. We would let them believe we were drowning in medical debt from my emergency surgery. We would give them the stage, the audience, and the opportunity to show their true character one last time. He said we needed to give the Kane family enough rope to hang themselves. We needed them to dig the trench so deep that when the dirt finally caved in, there would be no avenue for escape, no room for excuses, and no plausible deniability. We were going to sit at their mahogany table, eat their dry turkey, and let them mock the billionaire sitting right in front of them. A cold, dark thrill washed over me, numbing the pain in my side. I looked at the laptop screen one last time, memorizing the $82 million, and nodded. The trap was set. Thanksgiving was only 3 weeks away, and we were about to serve them a feast of their own arrogance. Thanksgiving Thursday arrived with a biting frost covering the Connecticut suburbs. We pulled the sputtering sedan up the long, winding driveway of my parents' estate. The property was a sprawling colonial structure, framed by ancient oak trees and manicured hedges. Parking our rusted vehicle next to Blake and Victoria's pristine imported SUV felt like placing a discarded tin can beside a silver platter. I turned off the ignition. The engine coughed twice before dying. I looked at Julian. He adjusted his tie and smiled. The trap was primed. Walking through the heavy oak front doors, we stepped into a theater of calculated affluence. The air smelled of roasting sage, expensive pine candles, and polished mahogany. Thanksgiving was historically my father's favorite holiday. It provided him a captive audience to display his accumulated wealth, functioning less like a family gathering and more like a feudal lord surveying his vassals. My mother greeted us in the foyer, wearing a tailored cashmere dress. She offered a brief, brittle hug, pressing her cheek near mine without making actual contact. Her eyes immediately darted to my waistline, scanning for signs of weakness following my emergency surgery. She patronizingly suggested I sit near the radiator because I looked terribly frail and pale. She handed Julian our coats, using 2 fingers, as if the fabric might contaminate her. Julian wore a dark navy suit. To the untrained eye, it was simply a quiet, unbranded garment. My family, blinded by flashy logos and loud designer labels, failed to recognize the garment's true origin. It was a bespoke creation cut from rare vicuña wool, crafted by a master tailor in Manhattan just days prior. It cost more than Blake's entire seasonal wardrobe. Julian wore his $82 million secret like a second skin, moving through the room with relaxed, predatory grace. The dining room table was set with heirloom silver and heavy crystal goblets. During the meal, the psychological warfare commenced. My family operated under the assumption that my hospital visit had pushed us to the brink of total financial collapse. They treated us like infectious pariahs. Victoria spent the first course detailing Blake's recent genius maneuvers in the financial sector, emphasizing his aggressive trading strategies and soaring portfolio returns. She spoke loudly, ensuring her voice echoed over the clinking silverware. Blake preened under the attention. He swirled a robust Cabernet in his glass, holding court at the end of the table. He directed his gaze toward Julian, asking how the little typing project was holding up. He suggested Julian look into entry-level data entry positions to help offset my mounting medical debts. I kept my eyes fixed on my porcelain plate, cutting a small piece of dry turkey. I played the role of the battered, desperate wife flawlessly. Julian chewed his food, swallowed, and offered a serene, placid smile. He replied that the project was finding its footing. His calm demeanor infuriated Blake, who thrived on provoking a defensive reaction. When the plates were cleared, the social segregation began. My father stood up, smoothing his vest, and gestured toward the enclosed heated patio. He announced it was time for the men to enjoy a proper digestive. He meant expensive cigars and single malt scotch. Julian rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket, and followed Blake and Richard toward the glass French doors. I watched the scene unfold through the paneled glass while my mother and sister loudly debated the merits of various interior decorators in the living room. On the patio, my father unlocked his polished wooden humidor. He extracted 2 thick Cuban cigars, handing one to Blake. He reached for a crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. Julian stood near the edge of the brick perimeter, waiting. My father turned around. He did not offer Julian a glass. He did not offer him a seat. Richard took a long, slow sip of his scotch, letting the silence stretch into the cold air. Then he pointed a manicured finger back toward the house. He told Julian to head back inside. He explicitly stated that the patio was a sanctuary reserved for actual providers, men who carried the weight of the world and generated real value. He dismissed my husband, telling him to go help the women clear the dessert plates. I expected Julian to flinch. I expected a flash of pride or a tightening jaw. Instead, Julian simply nodded. He looked at my father, then at Blake, who was smirking behind his plume of cigar smoke. Julian turned around and walked back through the glass doors. He sat down next to me on the velvet sofa, his expression radiating pure, unbroken tranquility. He knew he could purchase my father's entire corporate law firm with a single wire transfer and liquidate it before breakfast. The insult bounced off his armor like rain falling on concrete. The evening escalated to its cruel zenith during coffee service. Blake decided the passive aggression was insufficient. He required a theatrical performance. He stood up in the center of the living room, holding a small white envelope. He clapped his hands together, demanding the room's attention. He delivered a rehearsed speech about the spirit of the holiday, focusing heavily on the concept of charity and giving back to the less fortunate. He walked across the Persian rug and stopped directly in front of Julian. Blake extended the envelope, stating it was a little holiday bonus for the struggling artist. He claimed he hated to see a grown man unable to feed his own wife. My mother covered her mouth to hide a sharp giggle. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malicious delight. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. Julian accepted the envelope. He tore the paper flap open and slid out the contents. It was a bright green plastic gift card to a regional discount grocery chain. The bold white letters on the plastic declared a value of $50. The silence in the room was heavy, oppressive, and expectant. They waited for the shame to break him. They wanted to see his eyes drop to the floor. They wanted a reaction that validated their perceived superiority. Julian examined the plastic card. He ran his thumb over the embossed numbers. Then he looked up and smiled a genuine, radiant smile. He slid the $50 grocery card into the breast pocket of his bespoke vicuña wool jacket. He looked Blake dead in the eye and thanked him. Julian stated that true generosity always reveals a man's actual character. The response was so polite, so devoid of sarcasm, that Blake blinked, unsure if his insult had landed or missed entirely. The time came for us to depart. We gathered our worn coats in the grand foyer. My father stepped forward, eager to deliver the final blow of the evening. He cleared his throat, adopting a tone of fake, sympathetic regret. He announced the Kane family tradition of traveling to Aspen for Christmas. He detailed the luxury chalet they had rented, slopeside, the private ski instructors, and the 5-star dining reservations. Then he looked directly at me. He sighed, stating that they would love to invite us, but he knew we could not afford the steep price of the lift tickets. He suggested it was best for Julian and me to stay behind in our apartment and focus on paying down our medical bills. He patted my shoulder, a heavy, patronizing touch, and opened the front door to usher us out into the freezing night. We walked down the long driveway toward our rusted car. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I felt a strange, exhilarating warmth radiating from my chest. We climbed into the freezing cabin of the sedan. Julian started the engine. It protested loudly before settling into a rough idle. I looked over at the man who commanded an $82 million fortune. He pulled the plastic grocery card from his pocket, tossing it onto the dashboard. We burst out laughing. The sound filled the small car, echoing with the bright, terrifying joy of a shared, invincible secret. But as we drove back toward the city, the humor faded, leaving a sharp, analytical focus. I replayed the evening's events in my mind, dissecting the subtle cracks in their performance. Blake had been unusually abrasive. He drank his wine much faster than normal. His hands possessed a slight tremor when he lit his cigar on the patio. He sweated under his collar, despite the cool temperature of the house. Julian noticed it too. He kept his eyes on the dark highway, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. He murmured that a man only brags that loudly when he is trying to drown out the sound of a sinking ship. My family believed they held the high ground, but they were oblivious to the shifting currents of the financial world. Blake was hiding a desperate, terrifying truth behind his arrogant sneers, and his hedge fund was charting a direct collision course with ether dynamics. The Sunday brunches at the Oak Brook Country Club were an institution my mother treated with religious reverence. Attendance was compulsory. December brought a bitter freeze to the northeast, settling over the manicured golf course in a thick sheet of frost. The dining room was filled with women draped in heavy cashmere and men checking their stock portfolios on their phones beneath the white linen tablecloths. Julian and I arrived in our usual uniform of calculated poverty. He wore a simple gray sweater that had seen better days. I wore a wool coat I had purchased on clearance 5 years prior. The maitre d' seated us at my parents' usual table near the roaring stone fireplace. The psychological deterioration of a finance bro is a subtle process at first. It begins with the tailoring. Blake always wore custom suits that fit his frame with razor-sharp precision. But as he sat across from me ordering his third double vodka Bloody Mary before noon, his collar hung loose around his neck. His skin carried a pale, grayish tint. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face was replaced by a rigid, forced smile. He kept bouncing his right leg under the table. The vibrations rattled the fine china and caused the celery stalk in his cocktail glass to tremble. Victoria remained oblivious, complaining loudly to my mother about the delayed shipment of Italian marble for her kitchen renovation. Hedge funds operate on a delicate illusion of invincibility. Managers like Blake collect exorbitant fees simply for moving other people's money around. But when they make a catastrophic miscalculation, the resulting margin calls can wipe out their entire firm in a matter of days. Blake had bet heavily against renewable energy earlier in the year, shorting the very sector that was currently experiencing an unprecedented boom. His limited partners were demanding returns he did not possess. He needed a miracle to plug the gaping hole in his ledger. He needed a savior. My father sliced his prime rib and asked Blake about his first quarter projections. The question was casual, but in our family, it functioned as a strict status check. Blake swallowed his vodka too fast and cleared his throat. He leaned forward, launching into a manic, breathless pitch. He claimed his firm was currently courting a unicorn, a white whale that would redefine the entire energy sector and cement his firm as an industry titan. He tossed around technical buzzwords like predictive algorithmic modeling and regional grid optimization, hoping to dazzle my father with jargon. He boasted that this single acquisition would yield a 10 times multiplier for his investors and secure his personal legacy. I froze. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. Julian was calmly buttering a piece of toasted sourdough. He did not miss a beat. He chewed thoughtfully and asked Blake what made this specific company so valuable. Blake scoffed, rolling his bloodshot eyes at the peasant, daring to ask a high-level business question. He sneered and explained that the genius founder had just revolutionized municipal power load distributions on the West Coast. Blake stated that he had his analysts working around the clock analyzing the data. He claimed the founder was a ghost, an eccentric billionaire who rarely took meetings, but Blake assured my father he was inching closer to securing a 5-minute pitch. The sheer astronomical irony hung over the table like a physical weight. The eccentric billionaire Blake was desperately chasing was sitting 3 feet away wearing a generic gray sweater and eating a side salad. Blake was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, begging the universe for a fraction of the man's time, while simultaneously treating him like subhuman garbage. Victoria chimed in, adding that when Blake closed the deal, they were going to buy a second vacation home in the Hamptons. My mother clapped her hands in delight. Julian simply nodded, sipping his coffee, and wished Blake the best of luck with his outreach efforts. The next morning, Julian operated from our Queens apartment, but he was no longer typing alone in the dark. Ether Dynamics now occupied 3 floors of a prime commercial high-rise in Manhattan, but Julian preferred to work remotely to maintain our cover. He set up a secure, encrypted video conference with his newly appointed executive board. I sat on the sofa folding laundry, listening as the directors updated him on the operational transition. Then his chief of staff brought up the pending investment inquiries. The chief of staff shared her screen. She displayed a flooded inbox containing hundreds of solicitations from desperate venture capitalists and hedge fund managers trying to buy their way into the Series B extension. Julian asked her to filter the search by a specific domain name. He provided the exact name of Blake's firm. The screen populated with over 40 emails. They were all sent by Blake. The timestamps revealed a man spiraling into sheer panic. He had sent messages at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, and 5 a.m. The subject lines evolved from polite professional inquiries to begging pleas for a brief introductory call. The chief of staff asked if she should issue a standard rejection template and block the sender. Julian leaned closer to his laptop camera. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. He instructed her to do the exact opposite. He ordered his team to reply to Blake from a generic corporate address. He told them to string the hedge fund manager along. He wanted Blake to believe his pitch was under serious consideration by the elusive chief executive. He mandated that they give Blake just enough hope to keep him breathing, but never enough confirmation to let him sleep. Then Julian issued the final directive. He told his board that Ether Dynamics would be making its first major public appearance at the upcoming Global Tech and Finance Awards Gala. It was the most prestigious industry event of the year, where the elite gathered to celebrate the highest achievements in modern commerce. Julian instructed his chief of staff to formally invite Blake's firm to pitch their partnership proposal in person at the gala. He wanted Blake to put on a tuxedo, walk into the ballroom, and believe he was about to shake hands with his savior. The trap was no longer just a passive snare. It was a guided missile locked onto its target. My sister and her husband were measuring drapes for a non-existent Hamptons beach house, fueled by a phantom deal they would never touch. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff while Julian handed them the music. But to spring the trap with maximum devastation, Julian and I needed to shed our camouflage. The official invitations to the gala were about to arrive, and the Kane family was about to receive a profound shock regarding our guest list status, forcing a collision of two entirely different realities. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, interrupting the quiet hum of the refrigerator. A rapid succession of notifications illuminated the screen, originating from the Kane family group thread. The Global Tech and Finance Awards Gala was exactly 14 days away. My father uploaded a scanned image of heavy premium cardstock. His law firm had purchased a corporate table for the event. Blake followed suit seconds later, posting a photograph of his own ticket. His hedge fund had secured a spot in the general seating area. The text messages flowed in a frantic, self-congratulatory stream. They praised each other for rubbing shoulders with the Manhattan elite. They debated which bespoke tuxedos they planned to wear. The underlying message broadcasted to the group was unambiguous. They belonged to an exclusive echelon, and the rest of the world merely existed to observe their ascent. A separate notification popped up, breaking the chain. A direct message from Victoria. She typed a paragraph dripping with manufactured pity. She stated it was a profound shame Julian and I could not attend such a prestigious gathering. She suggested we clear our evening schedule and stream the event live on our battered laptop. She even offered to send us a digital gift card for pizza delivery so we could enjoy a special night inside our walk-up apartment. I read the glowing screen and felt a slow, steady calm settle over my nerves. I did not reply. Silence is often the most effective weapon against a narcissist craving validation. 10 minutes later, a sharp, deliberate knock echoed through our narrow hallway. I opened the door to find a uniformed private courier standing on the worn landing. He held an electronic data pad and a sleek, matte black box. He required a biometric signature for release. Julian stepped forward from the living room, pressing his thumb to the glowing green scanner. The courier handed over the package and vanished silently down the stairwell. Julian carried the box to our scratched dining table. He broke the wax seal. Inside, resting on a bed of dark, crushed velvet, lay two heavy titanium badges. They were engraved with precise silver lettering. The credentials granted all access VIP clearance to the billionaire circle. They were the highest tier of entry, existing far above the general admission tables where my father and Blake would be seated. Holding that cool metal credential changed my internal chemistry. For 3 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into their narrative of poverty. I had worn clearance rack wool and thrifted silk. I had swallowed my pride to maintain family peace. That era was finished. I grabbed my purse and requested a premium rideshare straight to Madison Avenue. I walked through the towering glass doors of an ultra-exclusive evening wear atelier. The atmosphere was hushed, smelling of fresh lilies and expensive textiles. A sales associate approached me, offering a polite but skeptical smile while evaluating my practical winter coat. I bypassed the standard pleasantries. I handed her my new heavy metal banking card and requested to see their private couture collection. The associate guided me to a secluded viewing room. She presented a garment that stole the breath from my lungs. It was an emerald green gown crafted from hand-woven Italian silk. The fabric cascaded like liquid glass, catching the ambient light with every subtle movement. The cut was elegant, dangerous, and unignorable. The price tag read $12,000, a sum that previously represented 6 months of rent and utilities. I did not flinch. I did not calculate interest rates or panic over missed utility payments. I nodded my approval. The associate swiped the banking card through the terminal. The transaction approved instantly. No hesitation, no declined warnings. The power of infinite liquidity felt like holding lightning in my bare hands. I carried the garment bag out of the boutique. The thick black canvas bore the designer's iconic gold logo. Before climbing into the waiting town car, I paused on the sidewalk. I pulled out my phone and took a single, stylized photograph. I framed the shot carefully, capturing the gold emblem against the backdrop of the Madison Avenue storefront. I uploaded the image to my social media profile. I did not write a lengthy caption. I simply typed a single, musical note emoji. It was a subtle breadcrumb, a silent declaration that the rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 4 minutes, my phone vibrated. It was not a message directed at me. My cousin had accidentally copied me on a forwarded text originating from Victoria. My sister had taken a screenshot of my post and sent it to my mother. The accompanying text was a frantic cocktail of outrage and disbelief. Victoria could not process the visual evidence. Her brain rejected the idea that her designated peasant sister possessed genuine purchasing power. To protect her fragile worldview, she immediately fabricated a delusion. She convinced my mother that Julian had visited a predatory payday loan center. She theorized he had mortgaged his non-existent future to rent a designer gown just to spite them. The Kane family echo chamber amplified the lie with terrifying speed. By nightfall, the rumor morphed into established fact. My father told his golfing partners that his son-in-law was driving us into certain bankruptcy merely to emulate high society. Blake laughed while recounting the story to his junior analysts, framing us as pathetic imposters trying to buy entry into a world we could never understand. They genuinely believed we were starving ourselves to afford a single night of fake luxury. They thought we were walking directly into an arena where they held all the power and influence. They were gleefully anticipating our public humiliation. They envisioned us standing outside the venue, freezing in the winter air, begging the bouncers for a glimpse of the red carpet. Blake was especially fueled by this fantasy. His hedge fund was hemorrhaging capital. His investors were demanding answers he could not provide. He viewed the upcoming gala as his singular opportunity to corner the elusive founder of Ether Dynamics and pitch a partnership that would save his sinking career. He spent hours practicing his handshake, polishing his pitch deck, and dreaming of the moment he would secure his legacy. He had no concept of the storm gathering off his coast. My family was preparing to wear their rented tuxedos and sit near the kitchen doors, believing they were kings of the universe. Meanwhile, Julian was finalizing the seating chart for the entire gala, dictating which global politicians and industry titans would be allowed to breathe the air near his table. The collision of these two contrasting realities was mere days away. The red carpet awaited, and the Kane family was about to step directly into a meticulously designed trap. The night of the Global Tech and Finance Awards arrived with a biting wind sweeping off the Hudson River. The venue was a historic ballroom in the heart of Manhattan, a fortress of gilded architecture and modern influence. Floodlights pierced the winter sky. Barricades lined the avenues, holding back crowds of onlookers, while minor celebrities and industry titans walked the sprawling red carpet. It was the apex of the American corporate hierarchy, a place where fortunes were born and destroyed before the first course was ever served. My family approached this arena with desperate theatricality. I watched from the tinted window of our idling vehicle as a rented stretched limousine pulled to the curb ahead of us. It was a vehicle that screamed of trying too hard, a relic of prom nights and bachelorette parties, rather than authentic institutional power. My father stepped out first, adjusting his velvet lapels. He extended a hand to my mother, who shivered in her fur stole. Victoria and Blake followed. Victoria wore a sequined dress that caught the flashbulbs, reflecting a frantic, scattered light. Blake clutched a leather portfolio tightly against his ribs. His face was pale beneath the harsh photography lamps. He was a man walking to his own execution, hoping the governor would call with a pardon. He needed this night to save his crumbling hedge fund. He needed to find the elusive billionaire of Ether Dynamics. They lingered on the carpet, posing for photographers who were clearly waiting for someone more important to arrive. My father flashed his practiced courtroom smile, believing he owned the city. Our driver smoothly pulled our vehicle forward, displacing my father's rented limousine. We did not arrive in a flashy sports car or a stretched novelty vehicle. Julian had arranged for an armored Maybach. The engine made zero noise as it glided to a halt. A team of white-gloved event staff immediately descended upon the vehicle, recognizing the license plate designation. The lead attendant opened my door with a crisp, respectful nod. I stepped out onto the red carpet. The freezing December air hit my bare shoulders, but the adrenaline surging through my veins neutralized the cold. The emerald Italian silk gown flowed around my silhouette, catching the ambient light like dark water. I did not wear costume jewelry. Julian had procured a vintage platinum necklace draped with unheated emeralds and authentic diamonds. The stones rested against my collarbone, radiating a quiet, undeniable gravity. Julian emerged from the opposite side, buttoning his bespoke tuxedo. The dark vicuña wool absorbed the camera flashes. He did not look like a struggling coder hoping for a handout. He looked like the man who owned the bank. Victoria saw me first. She was mid-laugh, posing for a minor blog photographer, when her eyes locked onto my dress. The sound died in her throat. Her jaw went slack. The physical shock rippling through her nervous system was visible from 20 feet away. She tapped Blake's arm, pointing a trembling finger in our direction. My father turned. The practiced smile evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden dark flush of anger. His brain, incapable of processing my appearance as legitimate, immediately categorized it as an offensive, fraudulent stunt. He believed Julian had mortgaged our fictional future to rent designer clothes just to humiliate the Kane name in public. Richard marched across the carpet, ignoring the velvet ropes and the snapping cameras. He intercepted us before we could reach the grand staircase. He lowered his voice into a harsh, venomous hiss, ensuring the nearby press could not hear him. He demanded to know what we were doing. He accused Julian of being a pathetic imposter, playing dress-up with money he did not possess. He told me I was a profound embarrassment, wearing stolen jewels to a venue where I did not belong. He pointed a rigid finger toward the street and commanded us to leave the premises before we ruined his evening. Julian did not argue. He did not raise his voice or defend my honor. He simply stood there, looking at my father with the detached curiosity of a scientist, observing a frantic insect inside a glass jar. Before the confrontation could escalate, the heavy brass doors of the venue swung open. The head of event security marched down the carpet. He was a broad man, wearing a severe dark suit and a transparent coiled earpiece. 4 additional security guards flanked him, forming a protective wedge. My father saw the security detail approaching, and a smug, triumphant sneer twisted his features. He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. He assumed the guards had spotted our fraudulent presence and were arriving to forcibly escort the imposters off the property. He crossed his arms, waiting for our humiliating expulsion. The security chief walked straight past my father. He did not even register Richard's presence. The broad man stopped directly in front of Julian. The chief snapped his heels together and bowed his head in a gesture of profound institutional respect. He spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried across the winter air. He welcomed Mr. Sterling to the gala. He announced that the private table in the Founders Circle was prepared and waiting. He gestured toward the entrance, offering his personal security team to escort us through the crowded lobby. The silence that fell over my family was absolute. It was the sound of a worldview fracturing into 1,000 pieces. My mother stopped breathing. Victoria stared at the security chief as if he had just spoken a foreign language. Blake, drowning in the stress of his failing portfolio, desperately tried to rationalize the anomaly. His mind reached for the only logical life preserver available. He let out a loud, nervous chuckle. He patted my father's shoulder and whispered that the guard must be confused. Blake theorized that Julian had secured a temporary gig as a handler or a personal assistant for a real celebrity, and the security team was merely expediting the staff. It was a pathetic, fragile delusion, but my father eagerly clung to it. Richard nodded, his breathing ragged, and turned his back on us, marching toward the entrance to reclaim his dignity. We followed the security detail into the grand ballroom. The interior was a cavernous theater of extreme wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, illuminating hundreds of tables draped in black silk. The seating arrangement at such events is a strict, rigid map of social hierarchy. The hostesses intercepted my family first. They examined Richard's general admission ticket. With polite, practiced indifference, the staff guided my parents, my sister, and her husband away from the glowing center of the room. They were marched toward the very back of the ballroom. Their assigned table was wedged near the swinging service doors, where legions of waiters rushed in and out carrying trays of hot food. It was the designated corner for minor players and forgotten guests. Julian and I never stopped walking. The security chief led us down the central aisle, bypassing the hedge fund managers, the real estate tycoons, and the minor politicians. We walked until we reached the very edge of the main stage. The Founders Circle was an exclusive, velvet-roped perimeter containing only 3 tables. We took our seats. To our left sat the mayor of New York and his entourage. To our right sat the chief executive of a major global bank. The waiter poured vintage champagne into our crystal flutes. I glanced over my shoulder. Far across the sea of black suits and glittering gowns, I could see table 42 near the kitchen doors. My father was squinting through the dim light, his face pale and rigid. Victoria was gripping her water glass, staring at the back of my emerald gown. They were close enough to witness the spectacle, but entirely powerless to participate in it. The house lights dimmed. A sudden hush fell over the 2,000 guests. The orchestral music swelled from the hidden speakers, signaling the beginning of the awards ceremony. Blake was sitting in the shadows, gripping his leather portfolio, sweating through his shirt. He was anxiously waiting for the host to announce the genius founder of Ether Dynamics, hoping to catch the billionaire's eye during the networking hour. He was blindly praying for a savior, completely unaware that he had just flicked a $5 bill at his feet 2 weeks prior. The stage was set and the microphone was hot. The atmosphere inside the ballroom hummed with the quiet energy of concentrated wealth. Sitting in the Founders Circle felt like occupying the eye of a hurricane. The service at our table was invisible and flawless. Waiters in pristine white jackets replaced crystal water glasses before they were empty. The mayor of New York leaned over to offer Julian a polite greeting, discussing a recent zoning initiative for sustainable urban development. I sat in my emerald silk gown, breathing in the scent of expensive orchids acting as centerpieces. Yet despite the barrier of velvet ropes and elite security guards, I felt the heavy, burning gaze of my father boring into my spine from across the cavernous room. Table 42 was a chaotic island of humiliation. Positioned directly next to the swinging kitchen doors, my family was subjected to a constant stream of catering staff rushing past with heavy metal trays. Every time the wooden doors opened, the clatter of industrial dishwashers bled into their conversation. My mother spent her entire evening trying to shield her designer dress from spilled soup and dropped silverware. Victoria sat rigidly, staring at the back of my head. She was trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile the sister she deemed a peasant with the woman currently clinking champagne flutes with global banking executives. But the true tragedy of the evening belonged to Blake. For a hedge fund manager, optics are the only currency that truly matters. Clients invest their millions based on the projection of invincibility and unending success. Blake built his entire career on loud displays of dominance, buying expensive European sports cars and boasting about guaranteed quarterly returns. He lacked actual analytical brilliance, relying instead on bullying tactics to manipulate the market. Now his fund was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. His reckless short positions against the renewable energy sector had backfired. His investors were threatening to pull their money by the end of the fiscal quarter. He needed a lifeline. He needed the Ether Dynamics partnership to survive the impending audit and avoid financial ruin. The house lights dimmed further, signaling the start of the formal program. A polished industry veteran stepped up to the grand acrylic podium. The ballroom quieted as the host delivered a practiced opening monologue, highlighting the resilience of the technological sector. The initial categories moved swiftly. Awards for sustainable agriculture algorithms and microlending platforms were distributed to polite applause. Julian watched the proceedings with relaxed interest, his arm draped comfortably around the back of my chair. Then the graphics on the towering digital screens shifted. The host announced the category for Innovations in Hedge Fund Management. I shifted my gaze toward the back of the room. The camera operator zoomed in on the nominated tables, broadcasting their faces onto the immense overhead monitors. Blake sat up straight. He adjusted his silk tie and pasted a confident, winning smile across his face. He had bragged to my father for weeks that his firm was a lock for the top prize, believing his trading algorithms were revolutionary enough to secure the trophy. The host opened the golden envelope. He read the names of the top 3 finalists. Blake's firm was not called first. It was not called second. It was omitted entirely from the final ranking. The winner was a quiet analytical firm based out of Boston. The ballroom erupted in applause. The overhead screens captured the exact moment Blake's manufactured confidence shattered. His pasted smile dropped into a grimace. His skin took on a sickening gray pallor. He reached for his scotch and drained the crystal glass in a single, desperate swallow. He poured another, shaking the decanter so hard the crystal chimed against the rim of his glass. Losing the industry award was a public execution of his professional credibility. Any potential client sitting in that ballroom just crossed his name off their prospect list. Blake knew his only remaining salvation lay in the post-ceremony networking hour. He had told my father he possessed an inside track to pitch the elusive founder of Ether Dynamics. He planned to corner the green energy billionaire, dazzle him with a presentation, and secure a merger that would erase his devastating losses. I watched Blake wipe a layer of cold sweat from his forehead, clutching his leather portfolio like a life preserver. He was a drowning man looking for a rescue boat. The waiters cleared the dessert plates, preparing the room for the climax of the evening. The host returned to the podium. The orchestral background music faded into total silence. The presenter grasped the edges of the acrylic stand and leaned into the microphone. He announced that it was time to bestow the highest honor of the night, the Global Visionary Award. This accolade was reserved for a single individual who fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern technology and commerce. The host delivered a compelling narrative. He spoke of an innovator who did not inherit a financial empire or rely on legacy country club connections. He described a brilliant mind who spent years working in total obscurity, operating out of a freezing, cramped walk-up apartment in Queens. The presenter detailed how this anonymous coder worked 18-hour days, surviving on cheap coffee and sheer determination to build a predictive data infrastructure. He explained how this platform prevented municipal blackouts and optimized regional power grids across the country. He stated that the resulting enterprise recently closed a historic funding round, achieving a $1 billion valuation in record time. Every word echoed through the silent ballroom. The host emphasized that true wealth and lasting influence are forged through relentless, grinding hard work, not through the shallow privilege of an inherited pedigree. He spoke about enduring the doubt of critics, the mockery of peers, and the profound isolation of visionary creation. I felt a lump form in my throat. The words validated every cold night we spent calculating grocery bills. It honored every single instance Julian swallowed his pride while my family ridiculed his ambition. Julian squeezed my shoulder, his thumb brushing against the silk of my gown. The host stepped back from the podium. He raised his voice, projecting a soaring, triumphant tone across the 2,000 attendees. He asked the audience to stand and recognize the recipient of the Global Visionary Award. He commanded the room to welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Ether Dynamics. The stage technicians cut the ambient lighting, plunging the cavernous space into darkness. A single, brilliant white spotlight ignited from the upper balcony. The shaft of illumination began a rapid, sweeping motion across the black sea of formal wear. It rushed past the tables of minor politicians. It glided over the seating areas of legacy real estate developers. It bypassed the sections housing the hedge fund managers and venture capitalists. The beam continued its frantic search across the velvet-draped room. At table 42, Blake was already half out of his chair, gripping his portfolio, scanning the darkness to see where the billionaire would emerge. My father leaned forward, eager to witness the face of the man who commanded such profound respect. Victoria held her breath, caught up in the intoxicating proximity to supreme power. The blinding shaft of light snapped to a sudden halt. It stopped directly on the founder's circle. It illuminated our table, cutting through the shadows with surgical precision. The circle of light bathed the emerald silk of my dress and the dark vicuña wool of Julian's tuxedo. The host leaned into the microphone one last time. His voice echoed like thunder bouncing off the gilded walls. He spoke the name Julian Sterling. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, and the truth was finally dragged into the light. The name Julian Sterling hung in the air, echoing through the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. For a fraction of a second, the room remained suspended in silent confusion. The global financial elite required a moment to process the revelation. The anonymous architect of the green energy revolution, the elusive titan they had all been hunting, was sitting quietly in the front row. Then the applause began. It started as a hesitant ripple near the center aisles and rapidly swelled into a deafening tidal wave of sound. I sat frozen in my emerald silk gown, feeling the physical vibration of 2,000 people cheering. I did not need to turn around to know the exact sequence of events unfolding at table 42. The acoustic feedback of my father's heavy silver dessert fork hitting his fine bone china plate seemed to cut through the roar of the crowd. Richard Kane dropped his silverware. His jaw went slack. The practiced courtroom arrogance he wore like a shield fractured into 1,000 irreparable splinters. Beside him, my sister Victoria stopped breathing. Her chest locked mid-inhale. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her nervous system. She was staring at the towering digital screens above the stage, watching the live camera feed zoom in on the man she had mockingly offered a $35,000 assistant position. Her brain simply could not reconcile the reality of the situation. The designated peasant of her family, the man she viewed as a pathetic burden, was currently being serenaded by the mayor of New York and the reigning monarchs of Wall Street. But the most profound destruction belonged to Blake. He sat, wedged near the swinging kitchen doors, clutching his leather portfolio. His skin turned the color of wet ash. A cold, sickening dread pooled in his stomach. Blake had staked the entire survival of his failing hedge fund on securing a meeting with the founder of Ether Dynamics. He had sent dozens of desperate pleading emails to a generic corporate server, begging for a 5-minute pitch. He now realized he had spent the last 3 years systematically terrorizing his only savior. He remembered flicking a crumpled $5 bill into an icy puddle. He remembered handing over a discount grocery card with a smug sneer. His career was dead. His legacy was erased. He was staring directly at his executioner. Julian did not react to the thunderous applause with wild enthusiasm or arrogant fist-pumping. He absorbed the moment with the calm, detached grace of a man stepping into a role he had prepared for his entire life. He stood up slowly from the velvet chair, adjusting the single button of his bespoke dark jacket. The banking executives seated to our right rose to their feet. The venture capitalists in the adjacent rows followed suit. A standing ovation swept across the cavernous room, row by row, until the wealthiest individuals in the country were standing in his honor. Before turning toward the stage, Julian looked down at me. The deafening noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. His eyes held the same steady, quiet gravity they possessed in our freezing Queen's walk-up when our checking account held a mere $42. He reached down, cupping my cheek with his warm hand, and kissed me. It was not a brief, polite peck performed for the cameras. It was a deep, deliberate declaration of unified strength. He was showing every reporter, every tycoon, and every lingering critic in the room that I was the untouchable center of his universe. He pulled away, offered a reassuring nod, and began his walk. He moved past the velvet ropes, moving with relaxed authority. The security chief walked 3 paces behind him, clearing a path through the throng of admirers. Julian climbed the carpeted stairs to the main stage. The presenter handed him the heavy crystal trophy, shaking his hand with profound reverence. Julian stepped up to the acrylic podium. The applause sustained for another full minute. He waited, resting his hands on the edges of the stand until the room settled into an expectant, breathless hush. He adjusted the microphone. His voice projected across the vast space, smooth and resonant. He began his speech by acknowledging the other nominees, offering genuine praise for their specific contributions to the technology sector. He talked about the inherent isolation of innovation. He described the countless nights writing code until dawn, watching the sunrise over the industrial skyline of the outer boroughs. He stripped away the superficial glamour of the evening, reminding the audience of the brutal, unglamorous reality of building infrastructure from scratch. Then the tone shifted. Julian gripped the edges of the podium tighter. He stated that while the industry readily celebrates the finished, lucrative product, it frequently ignores the human cost required to reach the summit. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal, quiet intensity. He mentioned that during the hardest years, the external world was rarely kind. He noted that visionary ambition is often mistaken for foolishness by those who lack the capacity to dream. He looked directly into the lens of the primary broadcast camera, knowing his face was currently projected on the massive screens directly above Table 42. He said there were individuals who looked at his work and called him a charity case. He mentioned people who told him to quit his foolish hobby and find a job flipping burgers. He quoted Blake verbatim, stating there were men who tossed loose change at his feet and told him to buy a clue. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a collective gasp of elite society reacting to the raw, unfiltered truth of his struggle. Julian did not name the abusers. He let the direct quotes hang in the cold air, functioning like a guillotine suspended directly over my family's necks. Then his gaze swept across the room, finding me in the front row. He softened his expression. He told the audience that when the rest of the world offered nothing but mockery and discount grocery cards, one person stood between him and total failure. He spoke my name, Madeline. He pointed to the emerald gown, the vintage diamonds, and the woman who worked double shifts in a pediatric clinic to fund a billion-dollar dream. He told the crowd about the nights I sat on a second-hand mattress, hoarding coupons so he could purchase server parts. He validated every sacrifice, every silent tear, and every moment of terror we endured. He raised the crystal trophy toward the ceiling. He declared that he did not build the empire alone. He stated that ether dynamics exists solely because a public school speech pathologist believed in a broke coder when her own blood relatives treated him like an infection. He dedicated the award to my endurance, my loyalty, and my unbreakable spirit. He announced to the global financial sector that the empire belonged to his wife. The ballroom erupted again, this time with a feral emotional intensity. Tycoons and politicians cheered openly, moved by the raw devotion of the speech. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek, keeping my posture rigid and proud. I turned my head slightly, casting a glance over my shoulder toward the service doors. My family looked like a row of pale, hollowed-out mannequins. The fragile illusion of their superiority was shattered, ground into fine dust by the standing ovation surrounding me. Their social currency was bankrupt. Their cruelty was broadcast to the precise demographic they worshipped. But the night was far from over. The ceremony was drawing to a close, forcing a chaotic migration toward the exit doors. Out in the sprawling marble lobby, the Kane family would inevitably attempt the most desperate, nauseating pivot of their lives, setting the stage for a final, devastating confrontation. The formal programming concluded, leaving the gilded ballroom to empty into a sprawling marble foyer. Photographers clustered near the exit doors, their camera lenses tracking our every movement. Industry titans who previously ignored us now maneuvered through the throng, eager to exchange business cards with the newly crowned architect of the green energy sector. We did not walk alone. The chief of event security maintained a tight wedge around us, his team creating a sterile buffer zone. I gripped Julian's arm, feeling the solid weight of the crystal trophy he carried in his other hand. The air buzzed with adrenaline and the overlapping chatter of wealthy opportunists desperate for an introduction. Through the polished glass reflections, I spotted a disruption rippling across the crowded room. 4 figures were shoving their way past annoyed banking executives and confused dignitaries. The Kane family was launching a desperate offensive. They abandoned the polite protocols of high society, physically pushing aside anyone standing between them and the billionaire they needed to claim as their own. My mother reached the perimeter first. Her previous posture of pristine country club detachment was gone, replaced by a grotesque pantomime of overwhelming maternal pride. She produced manufactured tears, letting them spill over her carefully applied makeup. She lunged forward, attempting to wrap her arms around my shoulders, acting as though we shared a deep, unbreakable bond. I took a deliberate step backward. The spatial shift caused Patricia to stumble slightly, her manicured hands grasping empty air. I did not speak. I merely looked at her, tracking the exact trajectory of her fake emotion. Growing up, she had taught me that affection was a transactional currency, rewarded only when I elevated her social standing. Her weeping faltered when she realized her performance was failing to secure an audience. The security detail shifted inward, forming a physical barrier between my silk gown and her desperate reaching fingers. She recoiled, her lips trembling as the undeniable reality of my rejection settled over her. My father advanced next, stepping seamlessly around his wife. Richard straightened his velvet lapels, projecting the false confidence he typically reserved for intimidating junior law associates. He pasted a wide, beaming smile across his face, exuding a nauseating brand of patriarchal warmth. He boomed my husband's name across the open space, calling him his boy. He declared to the surrounding reporters that the Kane family had always recognized the underlying genius of the Ether Dynamics platform. He tried to rewrite 3 years of psychological abuse into a narrative of tough love designed to forge a champion. Then Richard extended his right arm, offering a firm, celebratory handshake to the man he had spent years trying to destroy. 3 years ago, under the canvas tent of our backyard wedding reception, Julian had offered this exact gesture of respect. Richard had mocked him, leaving my husband's hand suspended in midair while 50 guests laughed. Now the pendulum of power had swung to the opposite extreme. Julian looked at the outstretched palm. He did not frown or sneer. He adopted an expression of mild, polite confusion, as if examining a strange artifact belonging to a forgotten era. He let the silence stretch, letting the reporters capture the awkward, agonizing delay. Richard's beaming smile began to twitch. The muscles in his extended arm trembled under the strain of the public rejection. Julian finally shifted his gaze away from the hand, leaving my father to slowly lower his arm in profound, stinging defeat. The public humiliation of the patriarch signaled Blake to launch his final suicidal maneuver. My brother-in-law shoved past Victoria, clutching his leather portfolio so tightly his knuckles turned white. His customized suit jacket was soaked with perspiration, ruining the expensive Italian fabric. He was gasping for air, suffocating under the crushing reality of his failing hedge fund. He bypassed the social pleasantries entirely, diving straight into the transaction that might save his career. He stuttered, addressing Julian with a forced casual familiarity, calling him man. He referenced the pending merger proposal, stammering a pathetic reminder that relatives must always support one another in the cutthroat realm of corporate finance. Julian watched Blake hyperventilate. The green energy founder reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew the bright green plastic rectangle Blake had mockingly presented during our Thanksgiving dessert service. The discount grocery voucher gleamed under the foyer chandeliers. Julian stepped forward, breaching the invisible boundary maintained by the guards. He placed the $50 card gently onto the smooth surface of Blake's portfolio. The plastic tapped against the leather, echoing like a judge's gavel, finalizing a fatal sentence. Julian lowered his voice, speaking with lethal, quiet precision. He advised the sweating hedge fund manager to use the funds to purchase a clue. He then delivered the final, unappealable verdict. He informed Blake that Ether Dynamics was initiating an official industry blacklist against his firm, effective immediately. He stated that no subsidiary partner or affiliated vendor would ever conduct business with him again. He was sealing off every avenue of financial rescue, ensuring the toxic portfolio would consume itself from the inside out. The color drained from Blake's face, leaving a chalky, hollow mask of pure terror. His legs lost their structural integrity, his knees buckled, sending him staggering backward into a decorative marble pillar just to remain upright. He dropped the portfolio, spilling his desperate pitch deck across the polished floor tiles. The execution was swift, clean, and bloodless. The financial predators had just been slaughtered by the very prey they thought they were hunting. Victoria watched her husband collapse against the stone column. Her own status, the designer handbags, the European vacations, the entire identity she built upon Blake's presumed financial dominance evaporated before her eyes. She clutched her sequined evening bag, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The reporters surrounding our security perimeter captured every frame of the carnage. The Kane family stood isolated in a sea of flashing bulbs, stripped of their arrogance and exposed to the precise high society demographic they spent their entire lives trying to impress. The lobby was silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters, capturing the fall of a dynasty. But the reckoning was not yet complete. My parents, panicking as their golden child's future disintegrated, turned their desperate attention back toward me, forcing a final boundary to be drawn in the marble hall. The lobby of the historic venue felt like a gladiatorial arena after the final horn sounded. The reporters kept their cameras raised, documenting the precise moment the established hierarchy of the Kane family collapsed onto the polished marble floor. Blake remained slumped against the decorative pillar, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the reality of his ruined hedge fund crushed his chest. Victoria knelt beside him, not to offer comfort, but in a state of pure, visceral shock, her sequined gown pooling around her knees as she stared at the scattered pages of his useless pitch deck. In the brutal ecosystem of high society, loyalty is a fluid currency tied exclusively to net worth. My parents understood this unwritten rule better than anyone. Standing in the epicenter of the flashing bulbs, Richard and Patricia Kane calculated their losses and executed a ruthless pivot. They recognized that Blake was no longer the golden child or the financial anchor of their retirement plan. He was a sinking ship. My father and mother immediately abandoned their favorite daughter and her ruined husband, turning their desperate attention back toward the new apex predator of the room. Patricia moved first. The polished, unaffected veneer of the country club socialite dissolved, leaving behind a frantic, aging woman terrified of losing her social standing. She closed the distance between us, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. Her hands shook as she reached out, stopping just short of the invisible boundary maintained by the security detail. Her mascara was smudged, tracking dark lines through the foundation on her cheeks. She pitched her voice high, attempting to project a tone of wounded maternal desperation. She begged me to intervene. She pleaded with me to speak to Julian and reverse the corporate blacklist against Blake's firm. She weaponized the concept of loyalty, claiming that blood relatives must always protect one another from outside threats. She pressed her hands to her chest, insisting that despite our minor misunderstandings, they had always loved me. She declared that they had raised me, provided for me, and taken care of me when I possessed nothing. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the cold air. 3 years of biting my tongue, 3 years of swallowing their insults to keep the peace, shattered into a million irreversible fragments. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or engage in a theatrical shouting match for the benefit of the watching press. I harnessed the cold, quiet authority I had learned from watching Julian build an empire from scratch. I looked at the woman who brought me into the world and dismantled her fabricated narrative using clinical, devastating honesty. I told her she never took care of me. I stated that she had systematically erased me the moment I chose a path that did not yield a country club membership. I reminded her of a freezing, rainy Tuesday in November. I recounted sitting in a dingy auto repair shop, needing a mere $500 to fix a broken alternator so I could drive to my pediatric clinic. I repeated the exact words she delivered from her luxury spa retreat when she told me my husband should go flip burgers to earn his keep. I gestured toward Victoria, who was still trembling by the stone pillar. I brought up the $8,000 quilted lambskin handbag my sister paraded at Sunday dinner, the very same week my mother denied me basic transportation. I pointed out that the Kane family possessed infinite resources to fund their vanity, but manufactured profound poverty whenever I needed a lifeline. My father stepped forward, attempting to salvage the negotiation. Richard tried to utilize his deep, baritone courtroom voice, the one he used to bully junior associates and intimidate opposing counsel. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, insisting that historical grievances had no place in modern business deals. He addressed Julian directly, trying to bypass me entirely. He called my husband a reasonable man, proposing they schedule a private lunch at his firm to mediate the situation and find a mutually beneficial arrangement. I stepped directly into my father's line of sight, intercepting his gaze. I informed him there was nothing to mediate. I told him he lost the right to speak to my husband the day he stood up at my wedding reception holding a glass of expensive champagne and branded Julian a charity case in front of 50 guests. I reminded him of the French restaurant where he watched Blake drop a $2,800 dinner check onto our laps, knowing we could barely afford groceries. I recalled his cruel amusement as I maxed out a predatory emergency credit card just to survive his 60th birthday celebration. Richard's jaw tightened. A dark flush of shame crept up his neck, but he could not refute a single fact. The reporters scribbled furiously on their notepads, capturing the detailed inventory of their cruelty. I saved the final, undeniable piece of evidence for the end. I lowered my voice, forcing my parents to lean in close to hear their own conviction. I asked my father if he remembered the winter gala at his country club. I asked if he remembered the live jazz music playing in the background while I lay on a bathroom floor with a rupturing appendix. I recounted begging him for a ride to the emergency room because my life was in actual physical danger. I looked at my mother and then at my father. I stated that they chose to drink champagne with the local mayor while I dragged myself to a hospital alone. I told them they did not protect me, they discarded me. Patricia let out a ragged, whimpering sob, pressing her hands over her mouth. Richard stared at the marble floor, his broad shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of public exposure. I delivered the closing verdict. I told them they spent their entire lives worshiping money and superficial status. I noted that now that I held the very thing they revered, they suddenly wanted to worship me. I shook my head, looking at their desperate, hollow faces. I told them their sudden affection was worthless, because I already knew exactly who they were when I had nothing. I raised my hand, halting any further pleas. I established the permanent boundary. I commanded them never to contact us again. I stated they were forbidden from approaching our home, our businesses, or our future. I severed the bloodline with a single definitive sentence. I turned my back on them. Julian took my hand, his grip firm and warm. The security chief issued a sharp command, and the perimeter opened. The crowd of industry titans, wealthy investors, and eager journalists naturally parted, creating a wide, clear corridor toward the glass exit doors. We walked out of the historic ballroom, leaving the Kane family standing in the cold ashes of their own arrogance, surrounded by the ruins of a dynasty they had destroyed with their own hands. The winter wind swept across the avenue as the chauffeur opened the heavy door of the waiting armored vehicle, signaling the end of an era and the dawn of a life they would never be permitted to touch. 6 months is an eternity in the financial sector. The descent from the apex of Manhattan society to the forgotten margins does not happen overnight. It is a grueling, methodical unraveling. We watched the collapse of my former family from a safe, insulated distance, receiving the updates through the unavoidable echoes of industry news and minor social channels. Blake's hedge fund did not survive the winter. The public execution at the gala, combined with the official Ether Dynamics blacklist, functioned as a terminal diagnosis. In the cutthroat arena of investment management, perception dictates reality. When the market learned that Blake had alienated the most powerful player in the renewable energy boom, his limited partners panicked. The withdrawal requests flooded his office. The capital hemorrhage triggered a series of catastrophic margin calls. To cover the institutional debts, Blake was forced to liquidate his remaining assets at a severe loss. The luxurious lifestyle Victoria had wielded like a weapon evaporated. The imported European sports cars were repossessed by the leasing agencies. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling suburban estate. I learned, through a mutual acquaintance, that Victoria spent the early weeks of spring hauling cardboard boxes into a modest 2-bedroom condominium in a working-class neighborhood. She was forced to sell her quilted designer handbags and her diamond tennis bracelets on secondary consignment markets just to keep the lights on. The socialite friends who used to drink mimosas with her suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. She became the exact demographic she had spent her entire life mocking. My parents suffered a different kind of ruin. They did not lose their primary residence, but they lost the only currency they truly valued: their social relevance. Following the gala, my father returned to his prestigious law firm, expecting to leverage his connection to a billionaire son-in-law. He attempted to spin the lobby confrontation as a minor familial disagreement, but the elite tier of American society operates on proximity to actual power. The executives and politicians knew Julian had permanently severed the bloodline. Associating with Richard Kane became a professional liability. His senior partners quietly urged him into an early, uncelebrated retirement to protect the firm's reputation. My mother experienced a similar exile at her beloved country club. The women who used to praise her taste in interior design began to look right through her. The invitations to charity luncheons and spa retreats simply stopped arriving. Patricia and Richard were left isolated inside their cavernous Connecticut estate, wandering through empty mahogany rooms with no audience left to impress. They had built their entire marriage and their family structure on the foundation of superficial superiority. When the illusion of that superiority was stripped away, they were left with nothing but silence. Julian and I charted a profoundly different course. We did not remain in the city to gloat or participate in the toxic social hierarchy. We packed a few sentimental items from our cramped Queens walk-up and left the broken sedan parked on the street, handing the title and the keys to a neighborhood mechanic who needed the parts. We purchased a sprawling, secluded ranch nestled deep in the Hudson Valley. Our new home was not a monument to vanity. It featured no golden chandeliers, no marble pillars, and no sweeping grand staircases designed to intimidate guests. It was built from raw timber and natural stone, surrounded by 200 acres of dense pine forest and open rolling meadows. The air smelled of fresh rain and cedar. The only sounds we heard were the wind moving through the trees and the quiet flow of a nearby creek. We bought privacy space and peace. We also understood the dangerous, isolating nature of extreme wealth. Julian refused to let his success transform him into the kind of unfeeling predator we had just defeated. Together, we established a private philanthropic organization called the Genesis Seed Foundation. We dedicated a substantial portion of our liquid capital to identifying and funding brilliant, underfunded technology developers who lacked a financial safety net. Julian spent his mornings reading pitch decks from young men and women working out of freezing garages and cramped dorm rooms. We provided grants that required no equity in return. We paid off their high-interest credit cards. We covered their rent and their medical deductibles. We took away the suffocating terror of a broken car alternator so they could focus entirely on building the future. Every time we wired funds to a struggling innovator, it felt like reaching back in time and rescuing ourselves. We were systematically dismantling the barriers that people like my father and Blake used to gatekeep success. The ultimate realization of our victory arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in late May. The spring thaw had transformed the valley into a vibrant sea of green. I was sitting on the wide, wraparound wooden porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The early sun warmed the wooden floorboards beneath my bare feet. I held a small, glossy piece of thermal paper in my hands. It was a black and white sonogram image. The grainy, sweeping curves outlined the unmistakable profile of our first child. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat had been detected just 24 hours prior. I traced the edge of the printed image, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of protective clarity. This child would never know the cold, transactional love of the Kane family. This child would never be evaluated by their earning potential or the brand of their clothing. The heavy wooden screen door creaked open behind me. Julian stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing a faded cotton t-shirt and comfortable linen trousers, looking rested and remarkably young. The dark, hollow circles that used to haunt his eyes were gone entirely. He carried 2 ceramic mugs, steam rising from the dark tea inside. He walked over and handed me a mug. He did not say a word. He simply sat down on the wooden bench beside me, sliding his arm around my shoulders. He leaned over and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against my temple. He looked down at the sonogram resting in my lap and smiled a quiet, satisfied smile. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the morning mist burn off the distant tree line. I thought about the twisting, agonizing journey that brought us to this porch. I thought about the backyard wedding, the freezing nights, the ruthless insults, and the final, devastating reckoning under the ballroom chandeliers. We possessed more capital than my parents could ever comprehend. We held the power to alter industries and reshape the global market. But sitting there, listening to the steady breathing of the man who refused to let me face a room full of wolves alone, I understood the actual definition of true wealth. True wealth is not measured by the digits in a bank account or the VIP badges hanging around your neck. The greatest luxury a human being can ever possess is the profound, unshakable peace of knowing you are surrounded only by people who loved you when you had absolutely nothing. Although it can be profoundly devastating to realize that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, the very family members who should have protected you during your darkest moments of financial terror and medical vulnerability, only measured your worth by your proximity to wealth and social status, the ultimate lesson we must take away from enduring such calculated cruelty is that true power does not come from seeking the approval of those who mocked your struggles, but rather from recognizing that your capacity to endure hardship alongside a partner who respects you when you have absolutely nothing is the foundation of an unbreakable empire. Furthermore, once the tides of fortune inevitably turn and the brilliance of your silent, relentless hard work is finally exposed to the world, you must grant yourself the unapologetic permission to establish permanent, impenetrable boundaries against the toxic opportunists who suddenly attempt to rewrite their history of abuse into a false narrative of tough love. Because the most luxurious and untouchable form of wealth you can ever possess is not a billion-dollar corporate valuation, a fleet of armored vehicles, or the fawning admiration of high society, but rather the profound, quiet peace of knowing you are surrounded only by people whose loyalty is authentic, which is a difficult truth that empowers you to walk away from the ashes of their arrogance and build a legacy of genuine compassion. So if you found yourself resonating with this journey of resilience, vindication, and the absolute necessity of choosing your own chosen family over biological obligations. I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and join our community here at Sophia Told Stories, where we continue to explore the breathtaking realities of ordinary people discovering their extraordinary strength. Leaving a comment below to share your own experiences with setting boundaries, and ensuring you never miss another empowering narrative about taking back your power and defining your own worth in a world that so often tries to put a price tag on your soul, reminding us all that true love is never a business transaction today.